I don't even know if he's still alive, honestly. This is from 1999. But back was awfully confident. Is there any evidence to verify the worship of Yahweh, so God, in the days of the conquest? This is pretty cool. So the Bible tells us when they established themselves in the land, the capital city was not Jerusalem. David, the capital city was, anybody know? Shiloh. It's where they kept the tabernacle. The judges' period lasted for 369 years. For the majority of that, tabernacle was at a place called Shiloh. And so everybody was like, well, let's go find Shiloh. That sounds pretty cool. And so when they go to Shiloh, they find one area that is really unique. It's cleared out of stones. It makes this perfect little rectangle. It looks like and everything around this area, by the way, is doing, it's hills everywhere. And it's rare to find like these flat plains. I've been there. You're climbs everywhere you're going. But this place is really pretty fascinating. It says the whole assembly of the Israelites gathered at Shiloh and set up a tent of meeting there. Well, the tabernacle had a fence around it that was 150 feet, or 100 cubits by 50 cubits. So it's 150 feet by 75 feet. And in the middle of that, you would have a tabernacle and out in the courtyard, you would sacrifice animals. And so they started excavating at this place. I've been there. There I am. And it says, Joshua erected the tabernacle at Shiloh, where it was 369 years. At the site, archaeologists found pottery. That's no big surprise. They found a bunch of animal bones. Why would there be a bunch of animal bones here? They found animal bones, clay ovens, because you have to replace the bread here. Tons of clay ovens here. Public baths, cleaning, always. Cleaning. Holes dug into the bedrock surrounding the perimeter of the tabernacle's proposed resting. There be holes bored into the rock. That's perfect measurement because you're putting fence posts in there. And they're right where they should be. And so they're digging, they find an ancient Greek inscription that's BC, where the Greeks long ago said, yep, this place is the village of Shiloh. So we know this is the right location. As they're digging around, they find horned altars, which you should expect to find, because that's where they would sacrifice animals. In this one location, they found 3 edges of an altar where there would be horns that look like this, 3 of the 4. The priest shall take some of the blood of the sin offering with his finger and put it on the horns of the altar for the burnt offering. Like, there's one of them. And this guy, by the way, this is the guy mentioned here, Dr. Scottling, director of the excavations at Shiloh. He comes in, and this is what he writes. Kosher. So all of these animals, there's no animals sacrificed that would have, like, aligned pagan gods. These are all kosher. They have to fit what the law of Moses was in Leviticus, and they're kosher. Young animals, many with signs of burn or butcher marks on the bones. Why would they be burnt? That's what you did with sacrificed animals. And they were mostly from the right side of the animal, and that blew away. And he was thinking, okay, why is it that all of like the thigh bones and everything else that I'm finding, why are they all from the right of the animal? Well, in Leviticus chapter 7, you're told that the right side of the animal was the portion which would have been consumed at Shiloh. The rest of the animal was thrown on the altar where it would have been to ash. But the priest would take the right portion and it would be spared. And so there's an overwhelming majority of these bones that they're finding that are from the right side. How else do you explain that? Like just coincidence, chance? It would have been sacrificed and eaten by the priest and the bones. And that's exactly what you find. This next thing's pretty cool. The priests are back then have to wear a particular outfit, an ephod. They have gems. The high priest would have 12 gems on his breastplate. And they were told had to have strings and belts around them. And on the belts hang bells. So priest walks around. It's like, I guess they were like sneaky people and they wanted to know where they were or something. Ching, 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 ching. And bells on them. But they also had to stitch in pomegranates. Marked pomegranates are a superfood. And it was to say that Israel is like this wonderful abundance. And what is the priest's role? He's leading you back into the presence of God, which is like a messenger from, right? You're going back to the garden. And so pomegranates and palms were all over the decorations. And one of the things found here, actually came off one of the high priest's garments. And it dates right to the period. The red thing that you see behind it, that's what a pomegranate looks like. And the stem of it looks really weird. It's got the pointy things going out. And so you can see over here, this is one of those items tied around the high priest. You can see the hole where the cord would have gone through, and you see them that comes down. This is one of those pomegranates that would have been tied around the edge of the priest. And you can scripture from Exodus 39. The bells and pomegranates alternated around the robe to be worn for ministering. There it is. It's crazy to think that 1,300 years ago, that thing was at the bottom of the hem of a priest, Shiloh, that was standing in the court of the Tabernacle offering sacrifices on behalf of his people. There it is. Pretty wild. This is from Joshua. This is kooky. I admit it up front, but I think it's kind of cool. One of the pieces that God gives to Joshua right out of the gates at the beginning of the book, he says, I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. And there's this weird engineering of cities that you find in Israel with a large number of cities. And what do they look? These cities are actually called Sandalim cities because they look like what? A foot. God will give you everywhere your foot treads, and then these are built in the image of a foot. Which is kind of neat. Maybe coincidence. I like it. Any questions so far? Did I confuse it? Yeah, Dice. Yeah. It looks like stone. I could find out. You can pull up the archaeology report on all these things. I guess it's stone. No. The one on the right, that's not the actual. It would be an emblem that's just like a bell, an inanimate thing that's symbolic. Would it what? The bells would. The pomegranates, I don't think, were made to. So they alternated bells to pomegranates. Good question. Any other questions? So all this makes, hopefully? All right, good. So, is there any support the biblical claims found in the book of Judges? So we're going to go through this. The book of Judges. So now we've got Deuteronomy. Moses says, go get them, boys. Go. Joshua's going to be your leader. Go conquer the land. Joshua goes in and they perform the conquest. Now the book of Judges gets really messy. It's like Joshua ends on a high note. Hooray, we've conquered everything. And Judges is like, can't keep it. It's constantly getting conquered by somebody. The people are really bright, it seems like. And so they do this pattern where it's like there's peace in the land and Israel is slaughtered. And then all of a sudden, they do evil in the eyes of the Lord. They start worshiping false gods. And God raises up or allows a foreigner to come in and to conquer them. And then they're like, oh, remember when we used to worship God? That was really nice. And so they cry out to God. God raises up a judge, which is a deliverer, somebody who rules and reigns and delivers the people. And then they're done and they praise the Lord until they start doing stupid stuff again. It's basically our lives. It's us. We follow the same pattern, except this is the course of a whole nation. And so they ruled under the law of God. They didn't have a king. The judges were the ones who administered justice. The cyclical pattern, and God always favors the underdog. Judges is a really disturbing book. There's a lot of stuff that happens in there where you're like, whoa. But God always the underdog in it, you'll find. So the first judge, is Othniel. Then the second judge is a left-handed guy, been seen as a cursed man in the ancient world. The next judge is a woman. Then the next judge is a coward. The judge is a fool. Then the next judge is a womanizer. Like you follow all these people and you're like, that's the person I would pick. And God keeps lifting up these underdogs to be saviors. So the first, and I'm going to race through these because otherwise it'll get boring. But in the book of, in chapter 3, we're told that Cushan Rishathaim, the king of Aram Naharaim, was in power. We now know that because of records from the Exodus, Amenhotep II, that the Mitanni were referred to as the Naharaim. Sound familiar? and that their kings bore a title, Reshet. Sound familiar? And so it's like the terms that were used back in those days when Othniel was a judge and overthrew the Matthias. All the names are spot on. That's what we should find. Then comes the judge, Ehud. How's the story of Ehud? This is always the favorite of the middle schoolers. He goes against this wicked king as a Moabite, and this guy is really fat. And he's like, one more question, king. And he gets in alone with him, and there's an 18-inch dagger. And then he takes his left hand, pulls out the sword, and sets the blade in him. And the guy's so fat that the whole sword sinks into him. And he's in a locked room. It's like pierced the intestines, so poo is coming out. And when the attendants come back and they knock on the door, and they're like, oh, he's busy. And so they don't find him dead for a while. And so that's Ehud. And sure enough, we're told that Eglon, the king that he went against, had a little palace that was built in ruins of Jericho. And when they did the excavation there, when Garstang did the excavation, he found the ruins of Jericho, this tiny little palace of a Moabite king. Perfect. Fits exactly. So then we get to Deborah, the female judge. This is a stele that was found in Egypt. So we're now 200 years after Joshua, and we get to the story of Deborah, our judge. And on the Merneptah stele, it says this: Israel is laid waste. So if Israel didn't exist, right? So the skeptics. Let's bring up the skeptics again. Israel is just a figment of our imagination. In 1213 BC, what is Pharaoh talking about? Israel is laid waste. Is he like on drugs? Like Israel doesn't he know this? But no, he's saying Israel is laid waste. It's been destroyed. Its children are not. And so what is that about? Because Israel is still around in 1200. You go into the record and it says Israel is laid waste, but when you read Deborah's song, which comes after she's triumphant, listen to how Deborah described the state of Israel before she shows up and overthrew the tyrant that had conquered. She says, in the days of Jael, which in her time, the roads were abandoned. Travelers took to paths. Village life in Israel ceased until Deborah, rose. And so Merneptah and the book of Judges agree entirely. There's this where Israel is laid waste. Deborah agrees. It's like the roads are abandoned. No one dares show them because the tyranny that's been thrust upon us was so intensely bad. And so you continue and you see again that Egypt now starts getting prominent. Hazor, which Joshua conquered, remember? And it says, after Ehud died, the Lord sent them into the hands of Jabin, a king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. Remember that name? The commander of his army was Sisera, and we know that's an Egyptian name. In Egyptian, it literally means servant of Ra, Sisera. And so you find the Sphinx pawls which is exactly what you should expect to find for an Egyptian thing. And we find out lots of arms from Egypt. The dawn of the Iron Age now. And the biblical era of Judges. The Canaanites now have iron chariots that the Israelites do not have. And so they're terrified of this army. And so they come up with a battle strategy. Deborah says to her general, I want you to go out and face them. And he's like, I'm not going unless you come with me. And she's like, okay, now a woman is glory for this victory because you've acted like this. And so they come up with a battle strategy that they're going to go side of a mountain where chariots can't go. They're going to lure Sisera, this Canaanite general with a name, and then they're going to come down the mountain and just rout all of these chariots. And that's what happened. Sisera runs away, and Jael is this woman whose husband is gone. Sisera runs in. She's like, would you like some milk? Right? And he drinks some warm milk, and he's like, oh, it's to be with somebody who's going to protect me. He falls asleep. Jael takes one of the tent pegs and slams it through his head and kills him. What's interesting is in Hebrew, you know what Jael literally means? What does she give him? Milk. What do you get from a goat? Milk, right? What's Deborah's name mean in Hebrew? Honeybee. What does a honeybee produce? Honey. And so in God's poetry, guess what? You have these two women who save. and it's a woman named Deborah who produces honey, and a woman, Jael, goat, produces milk, the land of milk and honey. Again, this incredible poet, and you find that in this story, that's exactly what you find. Jabin is a name, a dynastic name that would have been the king. And so during 170 years separating Joshua and Barak, the Canaanites were able to resettle, but credit for the final destruction of the Canaanite Hazor should go to the Israelites following the victory and Barak. And you go there, and under the destruction layer and the burn layer that you found from Joshua 170 earlier, guess what? Another layer of destruction that comes during the time of Deborah. Gideon, that's the next judge. We're told in Gideon that they destroy or conquer the city of, and when you go there, the modern city, you find blackened remains of burns that date back to the 13th century, the period of Gideon. This is pretty cool. When they're around in that city, guess what they find? They find a piece, a pottery shard named Jerubbaal on it. And if you remember, at the beginning of the story of Gideon in the Bible, he goes and he destroys an altar of Baal, and so he's given a nickname. What's the nickname? Jerubbaal. One who contends with Baal is literally what it means. And so on that pottery, you have the nickname of Gideon. In a Canaanite town, you wouldn't name your kid, he who contends with Baal. That would not be a good name. It would be like naming your child, he who hates God. Like, wouldn't do that. So this nickname would be really unique. Well, there he is, Jerubbaal. And I just preserved that little pottery fragment for us to find. Then you find Abimelech, is he going to be coronated at the pillar that Joshua erected? All the citizens gathered at the pillar in Shechem to crown Abimelech king. Well, there it is, still standing. No, it's the judge. The next judge, you get Jephthah, who's the kind of foolish guy, who foolish vow. Then after that, you get Samson. I love this. So, and Samson digging around at Beth-Shemesh, which was the border town between the Israelites and the Philistines. And Samson and the Philistines were always at it, right? You go to Beth-Shemesh, they're digging around, and they find this seal. It's a picture of a man grabbing the mouth of a lion. You see it? And unfortunately, this is a scratch mark on the coin. That's not like a little monkey riding the lion or anything. But this is grabbing the mouth of the lion. Like, what is that? The Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson, and that he tore the lion apart with his bare hands as he might have torn a young goat. This dates to the 11th or 12th BC, and for some reason, in the town of Beth-Shemesh, there's a story going around worth putting it on a minted seal of a man wrestling a lion. It's kind of convenient, right? It's almost like maybe that happened. You get further into the story, and Samson is part of what he's done. He's killed this lion, and now the lion dies, and honeybees go and fill the of the lion, which is really weird. It's not normal. Seems kind of miraculous almost. He's not allowed to touch dead stuff, but he's like eating honey out of this carcass and everything else. And so he said, "Put a riddle to you, Philistines. If you can tell me what it is, then I'll give you 30 linen garments and 30 clothes." And they said, "All right, put your riddle to us that we may hear it." And he said to him, "Out of the eater came to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet." The answer to the riddle is the dead lion filled with honey. They have no idea what it is until someone gives it away to them. But what's in that riddle? You know what honey is? It's the only food that never spoils. Do you know? Honey is the only food that never naturally spoils. And so when God says you're going to a land of milk and honey, with milk and honey, it's not literally like you should go there and be like, "Oh, I don't see it." What is honey? It means everlasting. It's milk. It's nurturing. It's from a mother. He's saying you're going to a land where the kingdom will never end. And it's going to be so intimate, like milk from your mother. That's what that means. And so now Joshua is saying, I want you to know that everlastingness is found in the dead lion. I'm reading into this a little bit much, I'll admit. What do you hear in that? Everlasting sweetness is found in the lion. Like, I just think God ordains these little poetic gospel. I think Samson doesn't know what he's saying, but the Lord, the Spirit of the Lord does. We find everlasting sweetness in the death of the lion. And so there he is. And so at the end of the story, you get this really, really crazy bit about Delilah, who's a Philistine wife that Samson takes because he's a womanizer. He's not Samson's not the guy you want your daughter to bring home. But he gives this reason because he has supernatural strength. He's been up as a Nazirite, which he takes these vows not to touch dead things or drink alcohol. He violates all of them. He's taking women who don't believe in God as his wives and girlfriends. He's a mess. But the secret of his strength that he finally tells to Delilah, and she betrays him. He says, a ray has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I will become weak like any other man. And you read that, and you're like, what? Is anybody else like, God can do it? Again, we believe in a sovereign God who is the dead and can speak universes into existence. If you want someone to be strong when they have hair, he can do it. But why? God doesn't typically do miracles that are meaningless. When you find God doing a miracle, dig. He's preaching. He's doing something. He doesn't just go, here's another trick, check this out. He's really strong when he has hair. So what is this? And this used to be like, all right, I'm going to have to teach you this. This is weird. I don't know what to make of it. This is what happens. The Philistines, when he shaves his head, they seize him and gouge out his eyes. They bring him down to Gaza, bind him with bronze shackles. And he's ground at the mill in the prison, but the hair of his began to grow again. And after it had been shaved, and now the lords of the Philistines are gathering up, they're like, we finally got this guy. Look how pathetic he is. We've gouged out his eyes. He has strength. We're making him push things with the animals. Look. The lords of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, really important, their god, and to rejoice. And they said, our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hand. Well, Dagon, we know from history, that's what he kind of looks like, we believe. There's differences on that, but that's what I think he looks like. So he's like half man, half fish. He's the god of the underworld for the Philistines, god of death. They're in his temple, worshiping him, and Samson's hair begins to grow back. Now look at this. We know now. All those tablets that you find in the background there that are kind of whitewashed out are called Mari tablets. And they teach us a lot about history. One of those tablets goes like this. The ecstatic is like cutting themselves and calling down the gods. You remember the story of Elijah at Mount Carmel? Those would have been prophets that are just going nuts trying to bring God's presence down. Pagan guys. Ecstatic of Dagon came and addressed me as follows. He said, the God sent me, hurry right to the king here to offer mortuary sacrifices. What does that mean? It's a sacrifice on behalf of the dead. Why? Because Dagon is the god of the dead. And he wants a sacrifice, a mortuary sacrifice for the Shiloh, which is this guy's son or grandson. This is what the ecstatic said to me. I have therefore to my Lord, that my Lord do what pleases him. Offer the sacrifice. Okay, so that tells us Dagon is a god of mortuary. What about the hair? Help me out with the hair. Another tablet. My Lord should deal with this. The man who told me this dream was to offer sacrifice to Dagon, and so I did not send him on. Moreover, since the man was trustworthy, I did not take any of his hair or the fringe across his garment. And you think, what? He's trustworthy, so I didn't need to cut his hair off or tinge from his garment. What in the world is that getting at? Well, the more we learn about the worship of Dagon, it says Mesopotamians who also worship Dagon considered omens to be more reliable and more than direct forms of divine communication, as evidenced from the library of Zimri, king of Mari. A number of ecstatic prophetic messages were delivered, generally credited the god Dagon, which were addressed to the king during his campaigns. Now pay attention. Ready? These messages were always accompanied by hair and garment samples from would-be messengers of the gods to be tested by omens to confirm the validity of their message. So let me stop you. If you went to Dagon and you wanted to know if his favor genuinely rested on a of God, what did you do? It was to be found in their hair or a sample from their garment. So Samson shows up with no hair. He's weak, right? Clearly, he's not favored by God, but his hair begins to grow again. What happens? God shows favor on him. What is God doing? This isn't just a miracle where it's like, oh, his hair makes him strong, neat, that's like or something. No. Why does God do that? So that when Samson shows up in the very of Dagon, where they believe that a person's hair reveals whether God's favor rests upon them, hair grows, and so does his strength. What message is sent to all those people in that temple, or those that will hear about what happened at that temple? This was the true man of God. And therefore, his God is the one true God. God is preaching. He's tearing down idols again. These aren't just kooky miracles. And so you get him placed in between these two central pillars in the temple of Dagon. Samson reached toward the two pillars which the temple stood, and bracing himself against them, what does he do? He pushed with all of his might and down the temple on the rulers and all of the people in it. So they start digging around Philistine areas over by the coast of the Mediterranean, and they found one. The temple of Dagon and Ekron, and you know how it was built? Two central pillars that held the temple. You go into an Israelite temple, they're all held up on the sides. Most temples in the ancient were up on the sides, but you go to a Philistine temple of Dagon, no less, central pillar. About the length that you would find a human being could get in between and push. You had the stone pillars that then held up wooden beams that held up the entire structure, and so breaking the pillars, like you see how in the art, these aren't stone pillars that are shattering. It's wooden pillars on stone bases that he is shoving over that are carrying all the weight, and the temple collapses. And Samson gives his life so that can have freedom in this position. Hear anything there? Our God is an absolute poet. And so I'm going to skip that one. Where are we at? 749. Samuel begins his ministry. All right, we're going to skip to the destruction of Shiloh. That's pretty cool. I'll do this and have to pick up on David next time. All right, so Samuel comes along. He is the last of the... So we're in the book of Judges. We're working our way toward 1 Samuel. He's the last of the judges. He's a prophet. His promises God that if he gives her a son, she will devote him to the tabernacle. So she takes her son and gives her to a high priest who's a horrible high priest. His name's Eli. His sons are even worse. Some things never change. Don't trust these preachers. So Eli takes Samuel and raises him up. His sons are exploiting women. His sons are taking bribes. His sons are using religious office. By the way, is one of the major stories throughout the book of Judges and the beginning of 1 Samuel. It's the religious leaders. They're terrible. By the way, that's a theme that continues into the New Testament. Anyway, never mind. So what happens is Hophni and Phinehas, who are his sons, they don't care about God. They're all in it for themselves. They say, hey, you know what? We're going out to battle against the Philistines. Remember when the Ark of the Covenant used to be really cool and it brought good luck to our people? Let's take it with us. And so they take the Ark of the Covenant, they have it carried to battle, and God is so disgusted with these religious leaders and how they treat their people that he shows no favor, and he allows Israel to get routed by the Philistines. Hophni and Phinehas are put to death. A messenger runs back and says, we've lost the battle. Your sons are dead. Philistines have captured the Ark of the Covenant. And he falls over off of his chair, breaks his eyes. And then we're told this crazy story at the beginning of 1 Samuel. Really so fascinating. The Philistines are like, we have their God. The God dwells between the cherubim of the Ark of the Covenant, and now we have their most sacred item. And so what do? They take it from town to town, and they mock God. And Israel fled before the Philistines. There has also been a great defeat among your people. Your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, and the Ark of God's been captured. And as soon as he mentioned the Ark of God, Eli fell back in a seat by the side of the gate. His neck was broken, and he died. Hear that. His neck is broken, and his two sons are dead. And so we're told then that the Philistines go burn Shiloh to the ground. They finish him off. Jeremiah tells us, God is warning them, go to Shiloh and see what I did to it. I let the Philistines just burn it to the ground. And Israel Finkelstein goes and Finkelstein leads the excavation, and he finds exactly what you should find. In 1050 BC, right where you should find it, Shiloh was destroyed by the Philistines. But then what happens? When the Philistines captured the ark, they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod, one of the Philistines. Then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it to the house of Dagon and set it up there beside Dagon. When the people of Ashdod rose early the next morning, on the morning of the second day, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took him and they put him back up in his place. So it's like, here's the people lifting up their God. And when they rose early morning, which is the morning of the third day, behold, he had fallen on his face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord, and the head of Dagon, and both of his hands are lying cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. And so what I want you remember the picture of Dagon? What does he look like? He's a fish. He's scaled, and now his head is smashed. And what I want you to hear in there, what happened to Eli? And the ancient, when it referred to your sons, you would hear people say, the son of my right hand, the son of my left hand. The sons were your way of functioning. They were your hands. And so when Eli falls off his throne, what happens? It's not an accident. He breaks his neck, and he's lost his hand. These are the people of God, and God shows the same judgment on Eli for his wickedness, the Dagon, who falls off his throne, and his head is busted off, along with his two hands. And what do you hear there? On the morning of the third day, the God of death is defeated. So think about that whole story. What happens here? You have really wicked priests. And what do? They're escorting the place where God's glory dwells, and they're escorting it around like it's nothing. It's just a cheap thing. And then they take it and they deliver it into the hands of the Philistines, Gentiles, who then take the place where God's glory dwells and parade it through their streets, take it into their temple of death. It stays until the morning of the third day when it has destroyed the God of death. Sound familiar? What is Jesus? Jesus in the Gospels, we read that the high priest and all of the people who should be close to God treat Jesus with absolute contempt. And they do. They take him and they hand him over to Philistines who parade him, the Romans who parade through the streets, who seal him into a tomb. And on the morning of the third day, death bows down to the one in whose glory dwells. God's a poet. I'm telling you, man, he is preaching all the time. All these stories just sovereignly woven together, pointing our hearts and our to Jesus. That means that when he brought this miracle for them, he's thinking about us. Because buried underneath all these stories, God who will destroy idols, who will conquer death, who will bring deliverance on the day. And so next time when we come together again, we're going to jump into David and Goliath and all the things. Because Jesus, guess who he is? He's the David. That's one of his titles that he loves. He's the son of David, but he's so much greater than David. And all of the victories that you've David and Solomon, Jesus is so much greater. A greater temple, a greater warrior, a greater king. Gosh, I wish we could do that today, but I talk too much. All right, any questions? All right, cool. Any questions before I pray? Marla? All of what things? They're in museums all over the world. Some of them are still there, like tarps and tents. One of the frustrating things we'll talk about next week, maybe, what makes the cutting room floor now. But one of the frustrating things is UNESCO, who governs the archaeology stuff, is so absolutely one-sided in who they favor. A lot of this is battles between Palestinians and Israel, where they're allowed to dig, what they're allowed to keep. Can you dig where the temple would have been? No. What do they allow the Palestinians to do? Destroying artifacts all over the place. It's really frustrating. And so it depends where it is, how it's taken care of. Like some of it's just egregious. It really is awful. Chip. I don't know that question. Does anybody know? How does a judge get his job? By God's order. So Othniel, for example, first judge, and it's just an offer. Caleb, who's a guy, I named my son after him, he's in the army, and Caleb says, okay, anybody who takes the city of Kiriath Sefer can marry my daughter, give them this land, and Othniel's like, sounds like a good deal. All right, you're a judge. Gideon, you'll remember when God shows up, the Lord shows him, he's like, oh no, I'm hiding. And God shows up and says, all right, I want you to fight for me. And he's, no, the wrong guy. No, I don't want him being my leader. And so Gideon's called like that. It's kind of random. It's whoever God calls. How does Deborah come onto the scene? I think it just tells us so it doesn't give us a backstory. She's a prophetess too, which is kind of interesting. So there's a female judge who's a ruler over her people, but she's also a prophetess through whom God speaks. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so Eli's grandson will be named Ichabod. You remember the story of Ichabod Crane, the headless horseman? That's where I always think of Ichabod. That name literally means the departed. And so Eli's entire line gets cut off after Ichabod, like he has departed that family. All right, yeah, last question, then I'll pray, and I'll take questions after. So all of these are available if you go to Rio Vista Church's subscribe YouTube. Mark could probably have better lingo. Go to the Rio Vista Church YouTube channel. They're all in there, along with all the sermons from Tom. And if you want the slides, I can put them in a PDF with you. And if you find anything wrong with them, I'm not an archaeologist. I'm not a historian. I try to be really full, and I try to quote people that are not believers, honestly. But if you find something let me know about it. I don't want to keep teaching anything that if it is wrong or you find a flaw in it. All right, let me pray first. Father, Lord, you are so good. You're so amazing. I love the way you love your people. I love the way that you bring these miracles, not just show more, but to show that every other power, all the other idols, all the other gods, all things that we trust in are weak. You're the God who saves. I thank you that you are a poet. You didn't just give us the lawnmower manual, but your word is rich and it's powerful and it's lit and it's active and it's bringing these incredible poetic stories to light and can look and see that you're not just a God that communicates, but you're a God that sings this of our redemption. And I thank you for that. I thank you for all the people who are here tonight. I pray that this would lead us to be smarter or more intellectual, but that we would leave here going, my goodness, he is real. And he has done this for his people for thousands of years. He will do it for me as well. Thank you for that hope and that trust and the faith, Lord, that you've given us. And we pray all this in Christ's name. All right, thank you. Have a great night. I'll be up here if you have questions.